Okay, so the help of Hashem, this will be the last thing on Yavul Nachri. After that, we're gonna get going. We're gonna move to the topic of Heter Mechira, the actual topic of Heter Mechira, which was initially the topic that we wanted to discuss. I'm going to mention next week what Menachem Nussbaum sent me. So thank you, Menachem, for sending me the Satmar Rebbe's tshuva on Heter Mechira. Very appreciated. So, very quickly, right, this was a controversy that basically dragged on for the majority of the lifetime of the Beis Yosef and the Mabit. They both sat in the same Beit Din in Tzfad, and it carried on for 7 Shmitot, 7 sabbaticals. They argued about this. How do you relate to the produce that's grown in a field that is under non-Jewish control? Okay, does it have the Kedushat Shvi'it? Does it not have the Kedushat Shvi'it? The nafkamina, the practical difference would be if you're allowed to do schayra, if you're allowed to sell and buy these fruits on the market. The other nafkamina would be a biur. Do you have to get rid of it at a certain deadline? As you know, Perish Shvi'is have to be removed from the home. They have to be disowned at a certain point in time. In other words, if you have tomatoes, you have to get rid of those tomatoes. You have tomatoes of Kedushat Shvi'it prior to the Gzer of Sfichin, but let's say you have peaches of Kedushat Shvi'it, right? When there's no longer any peaches available in the fields, then you'd have to disown your peaches. So the question is, would this halach apply to produce that was grown in the field that's under non-Jewish control? So let's just do things quickly. This is going to be the last year, whether we finish this Mar Makam Shita or whether we don't. So whatever we do together, we'll do together. The rest of it you can do as homework. I don't like when topics drag on for too long, okay? So, although my Rosh Hashiva always says, you know what the success of the Mishnah Berurah was? It is the Mishnah Berurah wrote his work together with his son, Rabbi Leib. So Rabbi Leib wrote a short biography of his father, the Chavetz Chaim, and he says, when we wrote the Mishnah Berurah together, we didn't set any time limits on any topic. We learned it until we had absolute clarity in the topic. Because we never put a time limit as to how long we're going to spend learning a certain topic. That's fine if you're writing the Mishnah Berurah, but if you're giving Shema, you people get tired of the same topic if it drags on for too long. So the Gemara in Gittim Mem Zayin Amar Aleph, that's a very, very important Gemara. We've seen it already. Rava says that Ein Kinin La'ovid Kachavim Lafkim Midei Meiser. The non-Jewish ownership of land in Eretz Yisrael doesn't have the capacity to uproot the inherent holiness of the land, and therefore the crops that grow in non-Jewish land in Eretz Yisrael still are subject to the obligations of Meiser. You have to take tithes. Okay? Shenemar Kili Kol Aretz Li Kedushas Aretz. It says Li Aretz. God says that the land is to me, which means to say that the sanctity of the land belongs to Hashem. So no ownership could uproot that sanctity. Okay? There is another opinion there, that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that a non-Jew, if he owns land in Eretz Yisrael, it does uproot the holiness, and therefore the crops are not subject to Trumas and Maasros. The Gemara in Bukhari Staf Yud Aleph, number 4 on your reference sheet, rules like Rabbi. Okay, the Gemara states unequivocally like Rabbi, that Ein Kin La'ovid Kachavim Eretz Yisrael of Kimidei Meiser, which means to say that even crops that are grown in a non-Jewish field are still subject to the obligations of Meiser. Although the Gemara in Bukhari says that is only if the miruach means you take the pile of crops and you make a neat pile, you smoothen the pile, that's considered the completion of the production, if you'd like. I'm speaking in loose terms. That's the point in time at which the crops become subject to the obligation of Trumas and Meiser, called machalik secretes called digun or miruach. Okay, so that's the point. So, in other words, if a non-Jew does the miruach, then the produce will not be subject to the obligation of Trumas and Meiser. So if a Jew does the miruach, then it will. Okay, but the fact that the crops grew in a field that was under non-Jewish ownership, that doesn't uproot the obligation to have Trumas and Meiser taken, so long that a Jew does the miruach, that the Jew does the final act of the production, if you'd like, of crops, for lack of a better term. Okay? So that's also the ruling of the Rambam, number 5 in your reference sheet. Let's read the Rambam. Goy shekana karka be'eretz Yisrael. If you have a non-Jew that buys real estate, buys land in Eretz Yisrael, if kimidei mitzvahs, it doesn't uproot the land from all the different mitzvahs, agricultural mitzvahs, it still remains in its sanctity. I'm just going to open the window. Okay? Okay? Now that's already the first clue that we have, that the Rambam says, Lo yifkir min ha-mitzvahs, it doesn't uproot it from its mitzvahs. Now, if the Rambam says that a non-Jew owning land in Eretz Yisrael doesn't uproot it from its mitzvahs, the Rambam presumably means all the mitzvahs, including the obligation to take meiser, the obligation to conduct the fruits as they were with Kedusha Shvius, correct? So if the Rambam said that non-Jewish ownership of land only uproots the obligation of, if the Rambam held that it uproots the Kedusha Shvius, and it doesn't uproot the obligation to take Trumas HaMaisos, the Rabbi would have expected the Rambam to make this distinction. The Rambam just states unequivocally, without making any distinctions, that Goy Shekana Karka Beretz or Leiv Kim in a mitzvah, it doesn't uproot it from any mitzvahs, which means the plain meaning of the Rambam is that crops that grow in a field that's owned by a non-Jew is still subject to the obligations of Shvius. Okay? Number 6. Now, this is where the Rambam gets extremely complicated. The Rambam has a knack of saying things that nobody could wrap their hands around. Okay? There's been a Shver Rambam. One of the Soloveitchiks, I think it was Rav Yoshiber Soloveitchik, said that when he grew up in his father's home, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik's home, all week there was a Rambam that was open. So this was whenever Rav Moshe would receive guests, rabbis, scholars, right, and they needed something to talk about, they would talk about a Shver Rambam, an extremely difficult Rambam. He says, and that was the atmosphere in the home. So that's why you get a son like Rav Yosher Soloveitchik, a brilliant Talmudic mind. When you grow up in a home where the whole entire home is centered around an open Rambam, an extremely difficult Rambam, and everybody that comes in, you discuss the Rambam, how do we resolve this difficult Rambam? The Rambam is somehow famous. He always manages to say something that seems to completely contradict the Gemara or some sort of statement that seems to be self-contradictory. Well, this is a case, certainly one of those Rambams, where the Rambam says something that seems to be an open contradiction with the Gemara. Okay, this is a very important Rambam, number 6. What does the Rambam say if you look at your reference sheet number 6? Goy shekana karka beretz, so if kimidei mitzvahs, it doesn't uproot it from the mitzvahs. Other B'Ktusha says the land retains its sanctity even though it's under non-Jewish ownership. Lefikach, therefore, im chazru Yisrael v'lachamenu, if the Jew buys the land back, then enik kivish yachad, it's not considered like a private conquest. And then the Jew will take Trumas HaMaisos. So what does the Rambam say? Non-Jewish ownership of the land doesn't uproot the inherent holiness of the land, and therefore, if a Jew buys it back, he'll have to take Trumas HaMaisos. What does that mean? Now, the Rambam seems to be indicating that as long as it's still under non-Jewish control, you don't have to take Trumas HaMaisos. Right? What the Gemara meant that non-Jewish ownership doesn't uproot the inherent holiness, that means that if a Jew buys it back, he'll have to take Trumas HaMaisos. That seems to be the simple understanding of the Rambam. This is the way most of the Rishonim Achronim understand the Rambam. The Kafter V'Ferach, we talked about the Kafter V'Ferach, one of the Rishonim from Provence. Right? He traversed the land. He's very famous for having drawn the borders of Eretz Yisrael. At the time, this was about 700 years ago in Provence, right, there was very little written about the halachas of Eretz Yisrael. So he was an early Zionist. He got up and he moved to Eretz Yisrael when the land was almost completely empty. And he wrote a book about the halachas of Eretz Yisrael. Right? Perhaps his greatest contribution, as I mentioned, is that he drew the borders of Eretz Yisrael, but he also talks about the halachas of Shvius, and he quotes this Rambam, and he says it seems that according to the Rambam, right, it's only when the Jew buys the land back from the non-Jew, that is when the land resumes its obligation to have Trumas HaMaisos taken. That's the understanding of the Kesef Mishnah. That's the understanding, number 8 in your reference sheet. That's the understanding of the Beis Yosef, who also wrote the Kesef Mishnah, but the Beis Yosef repeats his understanding of the Rambam in Shud Avkas Roichel in his responsa. Number 10, Rabbi Tzal Ashkenazi. Who is Rabbi Tzal Ashkenazi? He wrote the Shita Mechubetzet, an important work. It's really a compilation of Rishonim. But he himself was a scholar, a very great scholar. He was the Rabbi of the Beis Yosef, and also the Rabbi of the Arizal in Nigla, Okay, that's the way Rabbi Tzal Ashkenazi understands it in his very first Tshuva Siman Aleph in his response, with a twist, with a nuance. This is also the position of the Meiri, number 11 in your reference sheet. Look at the Meiri. I'll read the words of the Meiri. The Meiri is clearly reflecting the superficial understanding of the Rambam. That which they said that a non-Jew doesn't have the capacity to uproot the land of its inherent holiness. Right? Pirusha, when he gives it back to the Jew, right, then it's not considered as a private conquest. You know, there's a difference, there's a profound difference between a public conquest and a private conquest. When the Jewish people came up from Mitzrayim, they conquered vast territories of land, but they didn't permanently sanctify the land. Okay, why did they do that? One of the reasons was that there should be land surrounding Eretz Yisrael which should not be subject to the laws of Shvi'it. And this way, during the Shvi'it year, they would be able to import produce from the surrounding lands. You see that even when they came into Eretz Yisrael and they were conquering the land, they were already looking ahead in time, right? And they said, let's leave an option open so that we could do something for the poor people during the year of Shvi'is. Okay? But when Ezra, the second time, right, before the construction of the second Beis Hamikdash, when Ezra, after the Galus Babel, after the Babylonian exile, when Ezra came back and conquered the land, right, they conquered less territory, and whatever he conquered was permanently sanctified. Okay, so whatever Ezra conquered, until this very day, has the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, and anything that grows in these lands will be subject to the agricultural obligations of Eretz Yisrael. Now, that was only because it was a public conquest, but if a private individual, right, goes on and conquers a piece of land, right, a private conquest, a private individual doesn't have the capacity to infuse the territory that he conquers. He doesn't have that capacity to infuse it with the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, with the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So therefore, the Rambam said there was a thought that one could say, in fact, that seems to be the Rambam understood the Machlokes and Gittin Mem Zayin between Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar. Right? A non-Jew buys a piece of land, the Greek church, for example. A lot of the land in Eretz Yisrael is under the ownership of the Greek church. Okay? There's a whole issue about the lease ran out, and then they had a whole balagan. I don't know how that issue was ever resolved. But if you have non-Jewish ownership over a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael, when the Jew buys it back, the Rambam said there was an argument to be made that would be considered a private conquest. That you would not be able to reinfuse the land with its sanctity by buying it back. So says the Rambam, no. If a non-Jew owes a piece of land, he cannot permanently uproot the inherent holiness of the land. Therefore, if he sells it back to a Jew, right, the land will resume its obligations of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Follow that? Which the Rambam seems to indicate that all the whilst it's under non-Jewish ownership, it's not subject to any of the agricultural obligations of Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, sure.
About a yoga year and the return of ancestral land, that actually means in the case of non-Jewish.
Yeah, something to think about. This is also the Rambam in Hilchos Bikurim. Remember, there's an obligation that we take the very first crops of the Shivas Aminim, of the 7 species. Famous Rashi, everybody knows that when a little pomegranate, we see a pomegranate bud, you tie it with a, what does Rashi say? Every single time my kids bring back their parsha sheets, and the parsha sheet always says that the farmer ties the little pomegranate, or the little pomegranate bud, with a red string. And I'm always thinking, why do they keep on saying red string? If you go to the Kotel, charlatans will sell you these little blessed red strings, which I should mention, the Tosefta says that there's a number of things that you shouldn't do because of Dar Kimari, because they're Amorite practices, rooted in superstition. One of them is not to tie a red string around the finger. So I know that they're tying the red string around the wrist, but it's eerily similar to what's being described as an Amorite superstitious practice of tying a red string around the... Okay, but that's how you give me... In what sense?
Red string out the window.
Okay. Pasha Shlach. I got you. With Rachava Zonah. Okay. Talat Shani. Talat Shani is the red string. So, I'm not sure where they got this idea that the farmer would tie the little pomegranate bud with a red string. Rashi does not say a red string. It's a Mishnah in the third parak of Bikurim. The Mishnah says he would tie the bud with a piece of grass, with a gemi. A gemi is a reed. You tie it with a reed. Every single time my kids come in with their parsha sheet, somehow it says that he ties it with a red string, which is completely mistaken. It's completely incorrect. Okay, but one of the agricultural obligations of Eretz Yisrael is that you take the first crops and you bring it as bikurim, and you bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. The obligation begins at Shavuos time. I rest on the bus, PETA, or the Israeli equivalent of PETA, ran a ad on the bus stops against eating dairy on Shavuos. This is why they have an issue with the babies, because the animal rights organizations have a problem with dairy. I guess they feel that the animals are mistreated, that the cows are locked up in inhumane. I don't know how to call it inhumane. I can call it inhumane. I mean, they're not humans. Just put it on silent. So they said very cleverly. They said, Shavuot is not the Chag HaChalav. It's not the festival of dairy. It's the festival of Bikurim. Okay, that's what they wrote on the ads. Okay, it's the festival of Bikurim. Okay, so one of the agricultural obligations is to bring Bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash. So, same question, right? If you have a non-Jew that owns land in Eretz Yisrael and he grows crops, does he have to bring Bikurim? Certainly not. He's not personally subject to the obligation to bring Bikurim. But the Rambam says in Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Beis Halacha Tezvav, Hamoichas Adei L'Goy V'Chayzer V'Lach. Again, you sell your field to a guy. Then, when you buy it back, then you will bring bikurim. Because the land doesn't permanently become uprooted from its inherent holiness because it's currently under the ownership of a non-Jew. Okay? So again, the Rikorkos lived a little bit before the Beis Yosef. Okay? I know very little about the Rikorkos, other than his name is Korkos, which is funny because Korkos means a circus. Okay? So I don't know how he got that name. Okay, maybe he survived fighting the lions in a Roman amphitheater. Maybe that's how he got the name Korkos, because that's what the Romans used to do. They used to throw Jewish captives to the lions. Okay, while they used to eat exorbitant amounts of food, and then they would. Okay, Roman culture. So the Korkos understands. He says that the Rambam is going l'shitasai, that when the Gemara says that a non-Jew doesn't have the capacity to uproot the land of its inherent holiness, that means if you buy it back. But all the while that it's still under the control or ownership, if you'd like, of the non-Jew, it's not subject to the agricultural obligations of Eretz Yisrael. Now this is one of the most difficult Rambams in Mishnah Torah. It's an extremely, extremely difficult Rambam, and it's the Maharit, the son of the Mabed. Why did the Maharit get involved? Because the Beis Yosef, when he talked about the minig, when he talked about the custom that nobody was conducting the fruits of a Yevul Nachri, the fruits that grew in a non-Jewish field, nobody was treating it as, I'm just going to close the window, I'm just going to close the door. Right? As we've seen at length in the previous shiurim, right, that the Beis Yosef wrote at length to defend the common minhag that people were not treating the fruits of a non-Jew with kedusha shvius, with the sanctity of shvius. So one of his defenses, he says, look, the Rambam says indeed, right, a non-Jew cannot uproot the obligations, the agricultural obligations in Eretz Yisrael, but that's only once the Jew buys it back. But all the while that it's under the ownership of a non-Jew, you don't have to conduct it with shvius. So therefore, if you go to a field and you buy crops from a non-Jew, you go to the territories, you're driving through, I don't know what, Kfish Tishim, right? They have at the side of the road, you buy fruits, you don't have to treat with kedusha shvius, because when the crops grew, it was under non-Jewish ownership. So the Maharid, the son of the Mabid, said that it's impossible to say such an explanation of the Rambam because it contradicts many explicit Gemaras. Okay, so let's look at some of the Gemaras that this Rambam seems to be contradicting. Number 14 in your reference sheet. So Amar Rabbi. Remember, Rabbi is the opinion according to Mirul. Right? Rabbi was the opinion that stated that a goy doesn't have the capacity to uproot the inherent kedusha, the inherent holiness of Eretz Yisrael. So Amar Rabbi, so says Rabbi, Mina Aminallah. How do I know that? So this is the source from which Rabbi derived his opinion. Okay? Now Jews have to leave leket shechopeah. Leket is when they cut the crops, right? Inevitably there'll always be a few stalks that fall away. So the individual stalks that are left lying on the ground have to be left for the poor. Shechachas, if you forget a bundle of crops, of grain or paya, you have to leave the corners of the field, okay, without getting involved in the lachas of leket shich. What happens if a non-Jew decides to look at leket shich and paya? How do we relate to the leket shich and paya that a non-Jew leaves in his field? That's the question that's discussed in Gittim Mem Zayin. Now, why is that it's so important to understand? Because the leket shich and paya is not subject to the other obligations of Trumas and Maises. You need to take tithes from your crops. But a poor person that picks up leket shich and paya doesn't need to take tithes from the leket shich and paya. The leket shich and paya is not subject to the obligation of tithes. That's the halacha. Now, what if a non-Jew leaves leket shich and paya? That's the question of the brayso that Rabbi brings. So the Gemara says it is subject to the chiyuv of maasros. You do need to take tithes because leket shich and paya only has the status of leket shich and paya if it was left by a Jew. If a non-Jew left leket shich and paya, it doesn't have that unique status, and therefore it's still subject to the obligation of tithes. Okay, so what do you see? The crops of a non-Jew is generally subject to the obligation of tithes. Right? So the brayso stated that the leket shich and paya that was left by a non-Jew has to have tithes taken from it. You can conclude that the crops of a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael is subject to the obligation of tithes, correct? That's Rabba's source. This is the source from which Rabba determined that non-Jewish ownership of the land does not uproot it from its obligation of having to take tithes. Is that clear? Okay? So, what do we see from here? When those crops grew, if the non-Jew is leaving leket shich and paya, when did the crops grow? Whilst it was under the ownership of a non-Jew. Hey, wait a minute. You just told me that the Rambam holds, right, that the Rambam that rules in accordance of Rabbah, right, he holds that whilst it's under the ownership of a non-Jew, it's exempt from Trumas and Maises. You said that the whole nafkamina is if the Jew buys it back. That was the position that we wanted to make of the Rambam. We wanted to say that the Rambam holds that a guy cannot uproot its inherent holiness, and therefore, if he buys it back, it will resume the obligation of Trumas and Maises. But all the while, it's under the ownership of the non-Jew. What did you want to say? That the Rambam holds that it's patur. The Gemara just said the opposite. The Gemara just said if a non-Jew leaves leket shich and paya, that means it grew whilst it was under the ownership of the non-Jew. It is subject to Trumas and Maises. Question clear? The Rambam has literally contradicted a Gemara. Okay? Or this understanding of the Rambam. And the Marid brings 12 Gemaras. 12 Gemaras that are contradicted. The Rambam ostensibly contradicts. Okay? This is just the first, most explicit Gemara that's being contradicted in the Rambam. Okay? I'm not going to mention all 12 Gemaras, but I'll just give you another snippet. If you look at number 6, if you look at number 15, in your reference sheet, this is where the Maharid verbalizes, this is where he expresses this contradiction. If you look at number 16, right? What does it say? Rabba, the Gemara Mem Zayin said, even though a goy, a non-Jew, cannot uproot the inherent holiness of the land to exempt it from the mitzvahs of Tzlius Ba'aretz, the mitzvahs that are agricultural, but he still has the right to dig wells. Right? Lach bar boyes tzichin u'marisi. He's allowed to dig wells. He can't exempt it from Trumas and Maises, but he's allowed to dig wells. That's what Rabbi said. So a Jew could have some level of ownership of Eretz Yisrael. In what sense? If he owns a piece of land, he can dig wells. Or he can build houses, whatever. He has some level of ownership. Somebody says, when is he going to be digging wells? When he sells it, after he sells it back to the Jew? He's going to be digging wells, right, during the period that he actually has ownership of it. And it's during that period that Rabbi said it doesn't uproot its kedusha. So how could the Rambam say that it's only when the Jew will buy it back from the non-Jew, that's when it will resume its obligation? You see that even whilst he has ownership and he's digging wells, even during that time period, he uproots the kedusha. Or he doesn't uproot the kedusha, excuse me. Okay? Number 17, another Gemara that says that explicitly. But let's look at number 18 of the reference sheet. What does the Rambam say? If this Rambam wasn't difficult enough, the Rambam becomes more difficult because then he contradicts himself. Okay? So you see, my Rosh Hashiva says, Ma sod hanistater. Whenever he talks about a difficult Rambam, he says, what's the secret that's being hidden? What's the secret that's being camouflaged, right? There's always some sort of key idea, right, that unlocks the mystery of the Rambam. But let's see how the Rambam contradicts himself. The Rambam says, number 18 in your reference sheet, says if you have the fruits of a non-Jew, shagadlu b'karka shakana be'eretz Yisrael. Again, a non-Jew buys a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael and he grows crops. Im nigra malachta bi'ad akum u'marachon ha'akum b'ter miklum. We've already seen that if the non-Jew does the final act of the production of the grain, if you'd like, he smoothens the pile. We said that then everybody agrees that it's not subject to Trumas HaMa'isros. Remember, the gan chvaladogan akum v'imlachan Yisrael achar shenitlu shukoidim shtigma lachan. What happens if the Jew buys the crops? He doesn't buy the land back. He buys the crop. Yeah.
You might have misheard what you just said. You said that if the non-Jew, just repeat what you just said. I think I misparsed it.
Okay. In other words, really the underlying question here: at what point in time do crops become subject to the obligation to have tithes taken? When the production is completed. Okay. Now, production. What is production? Production is a loose term. So every single crop has a different definition of it's all listed in the Mishnayot in the first parak of Maasrot. But crops, for example, grains, is when you make a pile and you smoothen the pile, the Chachamim or the Torah viewed that as the completion of its production. It is at that point in time that the crop becomes subject to the obligation of Trumas HaMa'isros. Okay. For other fruit, it's different. Mara says, for example, with cucumbers, is when you put it in its baskets. They used to pile the cucumbers neatly in the baskets. When you finish piling up the cucumbers neatly in the basket, that's the point at which is the production. Every crop, the Mishnah goes to every crop, exactly. So, if the guy does the ma'aseh miruach, if the guy completes the production process, he's the one that smoothens the pile, so then it's his grain. It says, "Dergoncha, your grain is subject to Trumas HaMa'isros, not the grain that belongs to a non-Jew." And the question is, what happens? The Rambam here in Halachic talks about a case where the Jew buys the crops from the non-Jew and before the completion of the production, and then the Jew completes the production. Okay, so it's the Jew who buys the crops from a non-Jew. He's going through the West Bank, right? And he goes to the garden. He says, "Load up my truck with." So he says, "I'll pay you here. Take $100. Here, take 100 shekel." And he picks, I don't know, cherries, whatever it is, and then he piles the cherries up in a basket. So the Jew completed the production of the cherries. He paid the non-Jew, the Palestinian, to pick his cherries from his tree. Okay. So the Jew is the one that completed the production of the cherries because he's the one that made the cherries into a pile neatly in a vessel. So therefore, the Jew completed the production. The Jew needs to take Trumas HaMa'isros. If the non-Jew completed the piling of the cherries, then the non-Jew needs to.
The Jew completes.
That's right, exactly. So the Rambam says, if I bought the crops back from the non-Jew, if I bought the crops from a non-Jew, crops that grew in the field that is owned by a non-Jew, and the Jew does the miruach, okay, and after it was detached from the ground, but before you had the miruach, before it was smoothened into a pile, everything he's subject to obligations. The Rambam just said explicitly that even the crops that grow, right, in a field that is owned by a non-Jew, it's still subject to the. So the Rambam literally contradicted himself from one halacha to the next. Right? In halacha, the Rambam says that only when the Jew buys it back will it resume the obligation of Trumas HaMa'isros. Here, the Rambam is saying, I don't need to buy the field back. I don't need to buy the land back. I just need to do the miruach. So,
he's talking about two different things.
Is he talking about two? That's the question. How do you understand the Rambam? I mean, on one hand, the Rambam says, when the Jew buys the field back, then it will resume its obligation of Trumas HaMa'isros. Then the Rambam says that even if he doesn't buy the field back, it's just good enough for the Jew to have completed the process. Production, if you like. So how do you reconcile this Rambam? This Rambam is contradicting himself. So besides for contradicting a whole bunch of Gemaras, the Rambam even contradicts his own teaching.
That's a problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
It's a
yeah.
problem.
That's right. So,
I'm just thinking about some other examples where if the Jew is the one who has a role at a certain point that makes the difference. If the Jew finishes building, the kli, then it does not need to be toivel, even if a goy did other stuff. Or if, we're cooking, if the Jew lights the fire, that's enough for possible.
Yeah. It's like there's a big machlokes between Ramon and Shulchan Aruch. It's good enough for a Jew just to throw the match in. According to the Ramah, it's good enough for just the Jew to throw the match.
The point is, if the Jew has a significant a role at just the right time, it changes the status totally.
Yeah, exactly. So they do to get. You mentioned tefillas kelim, having to do tefillah. So they have now, you can buy production of pots and pans and other kitchen utensils, and it says on the box, this does not need to be toiveled. So what they do is they go to China. They have huge industrial areas where they produce kitchenware. So they run they do a run, and they some sort of legal application where the Jew will own, where as soon as the pots are completed or when the kitchenware is completed, at that point in time it's under Jewish ownership. They make some sort of legal transaction. So therefore they do a whole run, and then because for some people it's an incentive to buy pots and pans they don't need to toivel. You make a lot of money. You're in the shop and you see one pot advertises on the box, you don't need to toivel. The other pot you do need to toivel. So it can be how long it takes me to get around to toiveling things, right? It's something that you procrastinate. It's good for shalom bayis too.
I toivel all the time. It's a cable.
Yeah.
It's open all the time.
So I know somebody in Toronto that made a business of toiveling people's kalim. You would call them up and toivel a kalim. That's right. People have enough money, so you just call somebody and ask them to do it. I should mention it's important that if you send a child to do the tefillas kalim, it's not so pashut, it's not so simple. Are you allowed to believe the child that he toivel the keli or not? It's rabbanon, it's the chol chivut rabbanon. You could believe the child. According to some poskim, you can't even believe the child that he toivel the kalim. Okay? So I like to get a little off. I often throw in these tangents because it wakes people up. But I hope it doesn't distract people.
I literally, for a whole bunch of things, toivel literally in a river.
In a river.
Because where I lived at the time, there was nothing. Mm-hmm. Some there and some random person comes up.
That's a pasha you can toivel in a river.
What was that?
Zeichalim, mayim zeichalim.
Yeah, so the person was like, what are you doing?
You can't toivel in a river, it's zeichalim, you need mayim. Okay. I was thinking the zeichalim is certainly not kosher for a woman to toivel and purify herself for her husband. Although I'm thinking, does that akpad exist with tefillas kelim? The stomach also, yeah. Kosher tefillah, I presume. Okay, I don't know. Good question. So the Gemara says, so getting back to our topic, so what's the nafkamina? So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Madani Eretz. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach wrote a work on Shvius. He had the haskama of Rav Bengis, he had the haskama of Rav Yisrael Zalman Meltzer. So, what was Madani Aretz? It was about 20 simanim, all about Shvius to justify the Heter Mechira. Okay? So, Rosh Hashiva says Rav Chaim Kanievsky was a nephew of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was very diametrically opposed to the Heter Mechira. He was so against it, it cannot be overstated how against the Chazon Ish was, how opposed the Chazon Ish was to the Heter Mechira. So, he says, Rav Chaim Kanievsky in his magna opus, the Derech HaMunah, he quotes the Madani Aretz and other topics, and the topics of Trumais and Maestros. He says, but in Shvius, right, he never quotes the Madani Aretz. He boycotted the Madani Aretz on Shvius. Because the Chaim Kanievsky adopted his uncle's opposition to the Heter Mechira. But it's a very brilliant work. It's about 20 simanim. They put out a new copy in Tafshin Samches. It was redone very nicely by the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's sons. So he kind of goes about and gives some sort of mahalach, some sort of explanation of the Rambam, of this extremely difficult Rambam, aside from the explanation of the Grach, of Chaim of Brisk, which you can never understand what he says, because it's impossible to decipher what of Chaim of Brisk is saying oftentimes. Okay? So, even after reading Rav Shlomo Zalman, I read the Grach. It didn't explain it to me. It didn't reconcile the Rambam to me. I read the Rav Shlomo Zalman's first version of the Madani Aretz. It didn't explain it to me. I read the second edition of the Madani Aretz in Siman Chav Gimel, and then I got a little bit of an understanding of how Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is dissecting this extremely difficult Rambam. First of all, I'm really filtering a lot of what he said just to extract the key points in order to give this Rambam some sort of understanding. The question is like this. It's a critical question. It's the Sugya in Becharis Yud Aleph, the Mechaygis between Rashi and Tosfos. There's a big discussion there in the Mefarshim in Becharis Daf Yud Aleph. When we say that a Jew completes the production, what does that mean? That means that at the time of the completion of the production, right, that's the critical point in time at which the crops become subject to the obligation of Trumas and Maisis. What's the critical point? Is it critical whether a Jew or a non-Jew actually does the act? Or is the critical point who had ownership at the time of the miruach? Right? The nafkamina would be is, let's say the crops were under non-Jewish ownership, and then a Jew went ahead and did the miruach. The Jew did the physical act of smoothing the pile, but it was under non-Jewish ownership, or vice versa. For example, it was under Jewish ownership at the time of the miruach, and then a non-Jew came and smoothed the pile. You follow? Yeah. Right, so that's an important chakir. It's a machlokes rishonim. Okay? It's a machlokes rishonim. Tosfos maintains that it's not the person who does the physical act of miruach, it's who has ownership at the time that the miruach is done. Right? That's according to Tosfos. But the Kilas Yaakov already brings a number of rishonim in Kedushin Mem Aleph, 3 rishonim, the Ramban, the Rajban, the Ritzvah, 20, 21, 22 respectively on your reference sheet, that hold that no, it depends on who actually did the act of miruach. Okay, you can look at 20, 21, 22. Number 23, the Kehilas Yaakov. I'm reading from the Stipler, the father of Chaim Kanievsky, Mevur Didas Rabbeinu, that the opinion of these teachers, the Ramban, the Rajban, the Ritzvah, the Yisrael HaMamreach Peres Nechshavim Ruch Yisrael, if the Jew does the actual physical act of doing the miruach, then that is enough, l'chayva m'trumas u'maisros, that's enough to subject the crops to the obligations of trumas u'maisros. We look at who is the actual person that did the act of miruach, we don't look at who owned the pears at the time of the miruach. Okay? So we have a machlokes of Tosfos, at least certainly Tosfos, versus the Ramban, the Rajban, the Ritzvah. So stage number 1 of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is to assume that the Rambam holds like the Ramban, the Rajban, the Ritzvah, that according to the opinion of the Rambam, it depends who actually did the act of miruach, not who had ownership of the crops at the time of the miruach, but who actually did the act of miruach. That's stage number 1. So let that register, okay? Because it's a hard shir tonight, okay? I'm not. Sometimes I have entertaining shir when I get to talk about how the Rishonim fought with each other and how rabbis get angry with each other.
Sounds like surrogacy.
Yeah. I can see that. Okay. Now tonight is a lot of technical stuff. I'm trying to make it easy, but it's not an easy topic at all. It's maybe one of the hardest topics I've ever learned. So the first stage of something is to assume that the Rambam holds that, like these Rishonim, that it depends on who actually does the act of miruach. Okay, so that's stage number 1. I'll give that a second to sink in. Okay? Okay, stage number 1. Now what's stage number 2? Right? That the Rambam holds like this, that there's 2 dinim. One is afkal, one is a permanent uprooting of the obligation. Sometimes you can permanently uproot a certain obligation. So, and then sometimes you don't necessarily uproot an obligation, but you put it on hold, right? Or there's a certain something that's blocking or something that's preventing a certain obligation from taking place, if you like. So Rav Shlomo Zalman and also the Grach also makes this distinction. He says like this. This is number 25. If you want to look it through in the Beis Yosef, he says like this: if a non-Jew, right, would go to the fruits, he would go into the territories. He would go to drive down into Shechem, into Nablus, and he would go into a non-Jewish field. He'd gather the crops and he'd smoothen the pile. Okay, so normally speaking, right, you would say that since it's the Jew that did the actual act, right, you would say that it's subject to the obligation. In other words, that's the assumption that Shlomo Zalman Auerbach makes, that the Rambam held like the Ramban, the Rajban, the Ritzvah. Okay? But he says that the Rambam wanted to be mechadish that no. If the field is currently under non-Jewish ownership, then it wouldn't help the fact that the Jew did the physical act of miruach, that wouldn't obligate it. When we say that the Jew doing the miruach obligates it, that's when the Jew buys the field back. Okay? That's what he wants to say. But in any case, it's extremely difficult. It's hard to really reconcile, but I don't see how this has anything to do with Shvius. Right? Because Shvius, the inherent holiness of the land, the inherent holiness of the fruits, doesn't stem from miruach. It doesn't stem from somebody doing the act of smoothing the pile or what have you. It's something that's inherent. It's something the land, the real estate, the soil assumes a certain sanctity during the year of Shemitah, and that confers a certain status to the fruits. The status assume that holiness, that sanctity, by virtue of growing in this holy soil, if you like, during the year of Shvius.
No human hand.
That's right. It's not something. Rav Shamzan has a whole thing. Maybe it is something to do with the human hand, but I don't think it has something to do with the hand. I think it's the reality of the soil that confers a specific status to the fruit. Right. So even if you say that a non-Jew, that even if you want to say that with regards to Trumas Hamaisus is something that's a human obligation. It's not something that's in it.
Yeah. The whole question, but there's a question of if somebody does not declare the produce hefker, exactly what is it? Is it still?
So if he declares the produce hefker ownerless,
the person does not declare the produce.
Afkaita de Malka, yeah.
I do not declare my produce hefker. I'm supposed to.
Yeah, I'm supposed to declare
it. Declare my produce hefker.
Right. So very good. Excellent point. Excellent point. Correct.
And if that's the case, then it actually does say that that there is human interaction in the process.
Excellent. Very well said. Beautiful. You really hit the nail on the head. I don't want to get too complicated. What you just mentioned is that the question is, what happens if a person decides to lock up his field? Okay? And he decides, I'm not going to be mafkar, I'm not going to let the laws of Shvius take place. The laws of Shvius said that you have to open up your fields and you have to let everybody come and take fruit. And he refuses to do so. So he's in violation of the Torah command. Granted.
But you can't force your way out of the
Exactly. So this is one of the discussions that the Beis Yosef had with the Mabit. And the Mabit, that was the argument. The argument that you made, the Mabit argues that even if a person decides to lock his field up, the fields still have the sanctity of Shvius. You cannot prevent the fruits from assuming the sanctity of Shvius just because you lock up your field. It's something that happens automatically. Afkaita de Malka. It's something that God, the King of the world, right? It's a reality that's caused by Hashem. So that's what the Mabit said, right? The Mabit said that it's something that happens automatically. So you can't say that a non-Jew owning a field could prevent the fruits from assuming the status of Shvius. If you held like Rabbi Eliezer and Gittim Mem Zayin, that a non-Jew by owning a piece of field could uproot some of its inherent holiness, fine. Then you can say non-Jew owns a field in Shvius, so therefore doesn't assume status. But we don't rule that way. We rule like Rabbi. Right? Rabbi holds that a non-Jew doesn't have the capacity to uproot the inherent holiness of the land. So how could you say just because a non-Jew is not subject to the mitzvah, a non-Jew doesn't have to conduct himself in accordance with the mitzvahs of Shvius, because a guy only has 7 mitzvahs that he needs to observe. Right? The obligation to be mafker, to disown your field, is not one of the obligations that a non-Jew is subject to. He says, fine, a non-Jew doesn't have to disown his field, but that's not going to cause the land, that's not going to cause the fruits not to assume the sanctity of Shvius. It's Afkaita de Malka. That's exactly the argument that the Mabit made. That's exactly what the Mabit said. That's in Siman Chav Beis, in Afkar Zarchel, that's what you basically said. The idea that you presented is really it's the crux, or is very integral of the whole viewpoint of the Mabit. Okay? The Beis Yosef made a counter-argument. The Beis Yosef said, no. When it comes to Jews, it happens unconditionally. The fruits assume the sanctity unconditionally, but with non-Jews, it's conditional. And that's what he wanted to say. But it's very hard to understand. I'm saying that the Mabit is much, much more compelling. Right? So in other words, let me basically repeat, and this is the critical point. If you want to really summarize something in Al Regel Achas to understand the whole reasoning of the Mabit, in as much that we rule like Rabbi, that a non-Jew doesn't have the capacity to uproot the inherent holiness of Eretz Yisrael, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael is retained. A non-Jew can own a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael to dig wells. That's what he can do. To build houses, to dig wells, that's what he can do. But he cannot uproot the inherent holiness. So therefore, how could you uproot the holiness of Shvius? How could the fruits not have the sanctity of Shvius. Not only that, when it comes to Trumas and Maasros, there's a whole discussion in the Rambam how to understand how the Rambam related to Trumas and Maasros. Trumas and Maasros is an obligation on the human being. The human being has a personal obligation. So if a non-Jew does the miruach, then it's not Jewish crops, it's non-Jewish crops, so therefore it doesn't become subject to the obligation to take tithes. Okay, if it's currently under non-Jewish ownership, the way of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach understood the Rambam, that means that if he didn't sell it back to the Jew, then in this case the Jew, if he does miruach, it won't cause the fruits to become subject to the obligation. It's only when the non-Jew, when the Jew buys it back, right, and then a non-Jew owns the crops, then the Jew will subject it by doing miruach. It's complicated. Yeah.
There's also a big difference. You're right, and the Rabbanan here too.
Correct.
Right.
Shvis is Drabanan, but so is Trumas and Maasros. Trumas and Maasros is also Drabanan.
The Truma and Meiser is when it is very right. It's when the completion.
So when the completion, that's the point time at which the crops.
That's not the case, though.
No, Rabbanan is the same thing. The Rabbanan only subjected the crops to the obligation of Trumas and Maasros once it gets to the completion, which is smooth. Yes, definitely.
No, but there are a lot of situations where things are subject to Truma and Maasros to Rabbanan that are not the right.
Well, Deraisa, we ruled that Deraisa, there are only 3 types of crops that are subject on a Deraisa level: Dagan, Tirosh, V'yitzar, which is 5 grains, and then is Tirosh is wine, and Yitzar is oil. Tomatoes, cucumbers, apples, oranges, these are all subject only on a rabbinic level. Trumas and Maasros. Okay? So basically that's the thing. So I think when you get into discussion about Trumas and Maasros, then you can do all sorts of mental acrobatics, as Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and the Grach want to do, and say, okay, we rule that if a Jew does the miruach for a non-Jew, then it's subject to the obligation. That's only if it grew in Jewish land and it went over to non-Jewish hands, so then the Jew could subject it by doing the act of miruach. But if it wasn't then sold back to the non-Jew, then you can say that the Jew doing the act of miruach won't subject it. All sorts of mental acrobatics. That's all fine with Trumas and Maasros. When it comes to Shvius, there is no connection to Shvius. The Rambam, this distinction of a Jew that there's some sort of difference whether the Jew bought the land back or didn't buy the land back, that's a discussion that in my mind pertains exclusively to the realm of Trumas and Maasros. It cannot apply to the realm of Shvius. The Shvius is something inherent. It's a holiness of the soil that confers that same holiness to the fruits. The fruits have a certain status. And a non-Jew doesn't have the capacity to uproot any inherent holiness of the soil. So to me, it's a complete mystery to reconcile the opinion of the Beis Yosef. I think that if it weren't for the need to feed people during the year of Shvius, there's such a pressing need to provide the population with crops. I mean, the nation can't fast. The nation cannot go without food for an entire year. So we have to find some sort of header. But otherwise, speaking completely objectively, right, it seems like the position of the Mabit is a given. Okay, and that's where the Chazon Ish was so adamant about it. Baram considers it to cost somebody to do a schaira, for somebody to sell merchandise if you will nachri. He says, yes, it's Lefnei Ivor. Well, what about the Beis Yosef? The Chazon Ish said there's no 2 sides. I sympathize and I relate to the attitude of the Chazon Ish. Okay? Well, this was really difficult, so yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard stuff. But part number 2 of the shir is something you mentioned at the very first shir of Yivol Nachri, Michael. It says in the pasuk of Vayikra V'Ha'isa Shabbos Arz L'Chem La'achla. Okay, this is the pasuk in Parshas Bahar that says new point to try to prevent Yivol Nachri. So we're starting a new topic. Well, not a completely new topic, but they say Me'inyan Le'inyan Ba'isa Inyan. If we look at number 26 of the reference sheet, V'Ha'isa Shabbos Arz L'Chem La'achla, that the land should have a sabbatical la'achla, to eat. What does la'achla mean? Now listen to the Beis Yosef in Shut Av Kasrach Simach of Dalit. He says a tremendous chidush. Normally we expect only the Gemara to expound Psukim. The Gemara expounds Psukim to create halachas or to instruct us as how the halachas observe. But it happens every once in a while that a Rishon comes along, an Achron, that I can give you some examples, where they make their own drasha. They read a pasuk and then they teach you the halacha based on their understanding of the pasuk. So says the Beis Yosef, "In Banu Lodin Yosef Tam Yesh La'Omer Sheish Kin Lav Kim Shvius." Shvius is different than Trumas and Maasros. Why? Because it says in the Torah, Vayisa Shabbos Arz Lochem. It says that the sabbatical should be for Jews. Lochem v'loy l'goy, but not for non-Jews. Okay? So he wants to be darish the pasuk. He says, yes, non-Jews cannot uproot the sanctity vis-a-vis Trumas u'Maisros. When it comes to Shviyah, since the Torah says Lochem, so therefore the sabbatical is something that pertains exclusively to Jews and not to non-Jews. So therefore non-Jews, if they own a field, that's it, the whole Shviyah is out the window. Right. Extraordinary. It's darish pasuk. The Chazon Ish says it can't be, it doesn't make sense. How could Rabbi Yosef just learn a new drush from a pasuk? He didn't mean it, blah, blah, blah. The Chazon Ish wouldn't even entertain this idea, but it was said from the Beis Yosef. He's the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He's obviously a very important halachic authority. We can't just ignore the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Right? Now, the truth is that there is a safra in Parshas Bahar. If you look at the bolded section, it's actually supposed to be 28. I forgot to make a number there. So it's the unnumbered, it's the reference that doesn't have a number. Okay? Between 27 and 28, 27b, if you look in your reference, Lochem loy lacherim. What does it say? Lochem for you and not for others. So now if you saw the safra, what would mean Lochem loy la'achla? I would explain the safra like the Korban Aron. The Korban Aron is the commentary of the safra. What does he say? What does it mean la'lachem? She'en rasha s'zemen l'nocher. You're not allowed to feed shliach produce to a non-Jew. It says lochem, the sabbatical is for you, meaning to say you're to eat the produce of shliach, but non-Jews cannot eat the produce of shliach.
So that way people love to eat, they couldn't eat the
That's right.
Eat it. And that can't possibly be. It's
interesting, when I was learning in Kolos, Rabbi David Lau, the current chief rabbi, came to give a shir on shliach. He said that he wanted to support Otzer Bedin. Otzer Bedin is Shvi's produce. He wanted it to be served in the hotels because remember that to support the Jewish farmers, right, you hire them and you pay them to do work, and they're like an employee of the Bedin to gather the crops, so they have some sort of income during the year of Shvi'as. Now he wanted it to be served in the hotels of Tel Aviv and also in the hotels of Israel, again because you need to have a demand, you need to have consumers for this produce. And if you knock out all the hotels, you have much less consumers. The produce of Otzer Bedin doesn't have enough clientele. Otzer Bedin, right. So David Lau felt strongly that they should serve Otzer Bedin in the hotel, but his father, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, David Lau's father, after retiring from being chief rabbi, became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. So David Lau, the son, is the chief rabbi of Israel. His father is the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He says he objects. Says Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau had an issue of serving Otzer Bedin. He says there are many non-Jews that come to the hotel, and you're not allowed to serve Otzer Bedin, else you shmita produce to non-Jews. So you have a disagreement between the rabbi of Israel and the rabbi of Tel Aviv. So the rabbi of Tel Aviv, this is David Lau telling the story. He says the rabbi of Tel Aviv tells the chief rabbi of Israel, I personally object to serving Otzer Bedin in the hotels of Tel Aviv. But if you bring me a letter from the chief, speaking to his son, if you bring me a letter from the chief rabbi of Israel, right, then I'll bow. I'll yield to his position. Okay? So Rabbi Lau, the father of the chief rabbi of Israel, is telling Rabbi David Lau, the son of the chief rabbi of Israel, bring a letter from the chief rabbi of Israel, and then I'll yield, even though I personally object. Which means he was, in a very comical way, he was telling his son that I'll yield to your position, even though I disagree with you. Okay? So the simple meaning when the Torah says Lochem, that the sabbatical is for you and not for non-Jews, maybe I'll just do 5 minutes. Like when you say that the sabbatical is for you and not for non-Jews, it means you're not allowed to feed the Shvi'as produce to non-Jews. That's the simple understanding. But how was the Beis Yosef? Says the Pas Shulchan. I made a mistake. I made a slip of the tongue. I said Menachem Mendel Mishklav. It's Yisrael Mishklav, a brother of Menachem Mendel. Okay, so Yisrael Mishklav, the early pioneers of the Yishuv Hayashim, 250 years ago, student of the Gra, so he was the most eminent halachic authority in Eretz Yisrael, the Pas Shulchan. So he supported the opinion of the Beis Yosef. He wanted to permit Yevol Nachri. He wanted to say that the Yevol Nachri it's okay to be given over. So he writes a defense and he says, well, all due respect to the Korban Eidah, I will interpret the intention of the Safra that says Lochem v'lo lacherim. It's the way the Beis Yosef understood it. That there's no laws of the sabbatical that are subject to non-Jews, and therefore if you have a non-Jew growing crops in his field, then it's not subject to laws of license. So this is what you said at the very first year, that indeed this is some sort of mahalach, some sort of explanation that we could say that there's a difference between Shvi'as and versus Trumas u'Maisros, even though there are so many sources that give a strong indication that the Chachamim didn't distinguish between Trumas, Ma'aser, and Shvius, but because the need is so great to feed people during the year of the sabbatical, and after all, the whole obligation of Shvius is only rabbinic in nature, so therefore you're allowed to apply much more leniencies when you're dealing with a rabbinic obligation. Okay? The Chazon Ish was livid with this explanation, the Pas Shulchan and the Bissa. According to the Chazon Ish, it's scandalous that you can even entertain such a possibility. It clearly means you're not allowed to, the tension of the Safra means l'cha, means you can't feed non-Jews parish Shvius. It doesn't mean that the crops that grows in a non-Jewish field is not subject to the sanctity of Shvius. Okay, number 3 on the reference sheet, number 31, 32, you see that the Tosefta and the Rambam say you can't buy produce of Shvius from a non-Jew. The Tosefta and the Rambam didn't distinguish whether it was crops that were grown from a non-Jew in his field or crops that he took from a Jewish field. It says it unequivocally, don't sell or buy crops from a non-Jew, which, unless the assumption is, there's no reason to assume otherwise, that it's both in the case where it grew in the non-Jewish field versus a case where it didn't grow in the non-Jewish field. That's the proof of the Mabid. Number 34. This is a very compelling proof. What does the Rambam in number 34 say? V'yesh kinin la'akum b'Surya, afkim min ha'maisros. In Syria is the country, Syria, current-day Syria, that was captured by David HaMelech. David HaMelech went out and conquered Syria. Now, David HaMelech was considered a private conquest because when David went on to capture Syria, he didn't get prior permission from the Sanhedrin. So therefore it was considered a private conquest, which means to say Syria is not fully subject to the obligations of Trumas and Ma'aser and other agricultural obligations, but to some degree the Chachamim enacted that there should be some obligations. What does the Rambam say? In Syria, we're lenient that if a non-Jew owns land in Syria, then you could uproot it vis-a-vis the obligation of Maisros and Shvi'it. Here the Rambam says Shvi'it already explicitly. Number 34 in your reference sheet, the Rambam Hilchos Truma Paragav Halacha Yud. Here the Rambam already says explicitly that only in Syria could a non-Jew uproot the obligation for Trumas and Maisros and for Shvi'it. By inference, that means that in Eretz Yisrael proper, a non-Jew would not have the capacity to uproot. Okay? Let's jump a little bit around in the reference sheet, number 37. This is also a very critical Rambam. What is the Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah Ve'yovel Perek Dal Halacha? That's very important Rambam, 37 in your reference. It says the Rambam, Akum shekana karka be'eretz Yisrael v'zor b'shvius perisem mutarim. If a non-Jew buys land in Eretz Yisrael, right, and he plants it in the year of Shvius, then the Sfichim, where we said that the aftergrowth, the Chachamim forbade the aftergrowth, so nobody should have an incentive to plant and then claim that it's aftergrowth. So the Chachamim forbade all aftergrowth. Why did they forbid Sfichim in the first place? Somebody shouldn't wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, plant his tomatoes, and then say, I didn't plant anything, it's just the aftergrowth. So Chachamim said, no eating tomatoes. But since a non-Jew is allowed to plant in the year of Shvius, so therefore, they didn't forbid the Svich and the aftergrowth to grow in a non-Jewish field. You get that? Yeah. The Rambam is saying that there's no gzeira, there's no enactment to forbid the aftergrowth. Now, if the produce of a goy is not subject at all to the obligations of Shvius, it would be completely superfluous for the Rambam to say they didn't forbid the Svichim. Hey, what do you mean they didn't forbid the Svichim? If the produce of the non-Jew, if the Yivul Nachri is not subject altogether to the obligation of Shvius, how could the Rambam come along and tell you, but they didn't forbid the Svichim? So clearly by inference, the Rambam says, Svichim are okay. So you can, that's right, non-Jewish Svichim are okay. But everything else, the prohibition of Schaira, the prohibition of Biur, you have to get rid of it at a certain deadline, that by inference doesn't apply by a non-Jew. That's the next right, right? Makes sense. And that's the diuk of the Mabit, number 38 in your reference sheet, number 39 in your reference sheet, the Kaf Mefarach already, one of the Rishonim already makes this inference. Number 40, the Rash Mishatz makes the same inference, the Rash of the Bali Tosfos, the Benu Shimshin. Okay, number 42, right, in your reference sheet, part number 4, there's a Gemara in Yevamos, a very important Gemara. Now, get this Gemara, it's important. Number 42 in the reference sheet. You have this non-Jew that's selling fruit in the market, okay? So you go, I don't know what, to the Arab Shuk, and there's an Arab there selling fruit, okay? And he says, these pears, they grew during the first 3 years of the tree's life. That's what he says.
So they did grow in the first.
It's Arla, exactly. He's giving over a testimony that would forbid the fruits. He says, Shal Azika, and it comes from a locale called Azika. you don't believe him. You go after Rabbi. If the majority of the peaches that grow are not arla, you can eat it even if he claims that it's in the first year of your life, because he's probably saying that because sometimes the fruits are much more preferred. In some places they prefer the fruits that grow in the first 3 years of his life. So therefore you can assume that he's just lying in order to improve the reputation or to claim that his fruits are better, but you go after Rabbi. You don't believe the vendor that it's arla. You go after right, yeah. So what is azika? It says he claims that it comes from azika. So Rashi, in the first explanation from his Rebbeim, he explains it comes from the orchard of Ozek, and it's in the year of Shvius. Now Ozek is a locale within Eretz Yisrael proper. So he is selling land, let's say, outside of Israel proper, in Syria, whatever, I don't know, and he claims that it comes from an orchard. He claims that it was imported from Israel proper. Okay, so I'm in Syria, and the Syrian vendor there tells me that, these fruits, these are good, very high quality fruits, grade A, they were imported from Azika in the year of Shvius. So what does he say? You don't have to believe him and you don't have to forbid the fruit. Says the Rosh in Kiddushin, Perek Aleph Siman Zav number 44 in your reference sheet. He says that the Rambam, the Rabbeinu Tam, inferred from here that a non-Jewish field, the crops from a non-Jewish field is subject to Arla, and is also subject to Kilayim. Because you see that it said you don't have to believe him that the fruits are Arla. And then the Rosh says he proves, the Rosh, in the name of Rabbeinu, proves that we're talking about a vendor that is claiming that the fruits grew in a non-Jewish field. He says this came from the orchard of Azika, from a field that was owned by a non-Jew. Rabbeinu Tam says it explicitly. So now if you put 1 plus 1 together, you have this vendor in Syria that says, look, my Drew's cousin in Israel proper owns an orchard in Azika, is under non-Jewish ownership, and according to the testimony of this non-Jew, it grew in his cousin's field in Israel proper, which is Shvius. You don't have to believe him and you don't have to suspect that this is the fruits of Shvius. This is an explicit proof. Rabbeinu Tam and the Rosh held that even when a non-Jew owns a field, it's still subject to the obligations of Trumas U'Maisra. It's still subject to the obligation of Arla, Kilayim, and Shvius. The Ramban, El Al-Tayr, and Vayikra Per Chafei, in the last explanation, learns the Gemara the same way. So here, the Beis Yosef had to acknowledge, I agree with you, you're right. According to the Rosh and the Rabbeinu Tam, it's explicitly clear, it's unequivocal, that they hold that the Yevul Nachri is subject to the fruits of Shvius. Right? Because you see, again, let me repeat the case, you go to Syria, and the guy is saying that this is imported from my cousin's field in Israel proper, and he claims that it's in the year of Shvius, and he says that it grew in a non-Jewish field. The Gemara says, because you can assume he's lying, you don't have to trust him. But if you would have trusted him, you would have forbade the fruits, or would have treated the fruits as Kedusha Shvius. Okay? So the Rambam said, okay, well, we rely on the Rambam. The Rambam held otherwise. What Rambam is he talking about? The Rambam we discussed at the beginning of this year, that it's only when the Jew brought it back, but it's extremely difficult. Okay, so which means to say, I'm going to end the shir. There's a lot more to see. You can do it as homework. But the bottom line is that Yevul Nachri, according to many Rishonim, is certainly forbidden. Okay? According to the Rosh and the Rabbeinu Tam, it's certainly, I shouldn't say forbidden, it has the status of Perish Shvius. The way the Rambam learned that there's a nafkamina whether you bought it back, that whole nafkamina is only for Trumas and Maisros. It cannot make an effect on, we rule that a guy doesn't have the capacity. I mean, if you look at the Mabed brings so many Gemaras and Mishnayos from the Tosefta and the Dmai, there's so many sources that indicate clearly that that even what's grown in a non-Jewish field is subject to the Kedushas Paris. In fact, we said the Rambam stated explicitly, only in Syria a Jew has the capacity. A field in Syria, a non-Jew could uproot his holiness, but not in Israel proper. So why are we mekel? We have to be mekel. We don't have a choice. On what basis are we being mekel? Right? So the first basis that we're being mekel is that Shvius is Drabanan. And I would say the only mahalach that you can say is that if you understand when the Sifri says lochem, that the sabbatical's lochem is for you and not for goyim, you don't interpret it as the Karban Aaron interpreted it. That means that you're not allowed to feed non-Jews Shvius. It means lochem, that only you are subject to the obligations of Shvius. And when the Radvaz actually had a mahalach. The Radvaz in his parish of the Rambam said that he asks the question, why is everybody being mekel with the parish Shvius? Right? He says clearly the fruits that are growing in non-Jewish field is subject to the Kedusha of Shvius. He says, because Shemitah is Drabanan, so, and even though we normally like Rabbi says that a guy cannot uproot the inherent Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. But because Shvius is Drabanan, and it's a B'shas Chak, he writes in Mefurish, it's only Drabanan, and there's nothing to eat, so we'll rely on the other opinion of the Gemara that says a Jew could uproot the sanctity of Shvius. How could you rely on that opinion? The Sefer Truma is mistapik if we were like Rabbi or Rabbi Eliezer, so under these extenuating circumstances we'll make them. Okay, and that was the minhag. So basically, you see that you're able to apply certain extreme leniencies. So the first stage of the Heter Mechira is to first of all acknowledge that the whole Heter Mechira, which is based on the notion that if you sell a land to a non-Jew that it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius, that itself is already a huge leniency. That itself is already an extreme leniency. Okay, and we'll discuss next week. Next week the topic will be Heter Mechira. Maybe we'll start with the whole topic: are you allowed to give non-Jews a foothold in the land? Are you violating like Techanim by selling a piece of land to them? So I think the Radvaz is a mahalach. The Beis Yosef gives a little bit of a mahalach, but I understand, or at least I can sympathize why the Chazon Ish was so adamant. And the Mabit fought a war over this. He said for 7 Shmitas he fought a war, and he got the upper side. He gained the upper hand in the end, because the Charedim writes that the minhag changed to accord with to conform with the Mabit. And the Shla already was the Rabbi of Yerushalayim. He came from Poland. He came the Rabbi. He already testified that the minhag became. And therefore, the Chazon Ish said, even if the Beis Yosef was matir, that was based on the minhag, right, during his lifetime. But since after his lifetime, the minhag changed. So the Chazon Ish said, now you can't even rely on the Beis Yosef. Okay, that's the idea. That's the sum up of the Ibn Nachman.
Today we hold that Nufri is not
Perish Shvius. Yeah.
Between the fact that there's some evidence that Shemitah applies only to Jews, and it's all the Rabbanan now.
That's right, and it's extenuating circumstances. Between those, we're makel.
That's enough.
That's enough to makel. But I personally, I wouldn't say it might be a nice idea if you want to be a super Jew. Some people love chumras, but it's a nice chumrah that even if you buy Yivol Nachri, you buy non-Jewish products, to treat it with the Kedusha Shvius. All right, which means to say, don't ruin it, don't throw it away, treat it with respect. Okay, don't worry, you don't have to worry about the deadline, because
that's kind of tough though, because if you're going to treat it as if it has
Kedusha Shvius, and you're not allowed to be doing.
They can't buy it.
They can't buy it, but we're buying Oitzer Bezdin, right?
Because I was actually driving in the north today. Like these Arabs on the side of the road selling produce. I'd really like to buy some of it.
So they say you can.
If it wasn't a Shemitah year, it's like I could buy it.
No, but on the contrary, if it wouldn't be a Shvius year, if it wouldn't be a Shemitah, you would buy it from the non-Jews.
I could buy it if I can take Tum and Maser without the blessing if I want.
Right.
But this year I have no clue what I can and can't do, so I didn't buy it.
Okay. Listen, if you would have bought it, the minhag is to make again. If something is drabanan and you have a minhag, hey mom, ruve hey mom, but the whole thing is rabbinic, and the minhag gave you a green light to do what would essentially seem to be asur. Okay, so we'll stop over here. If you want, you can see the rest of the sources as homework. Okay.